Right guys, hope you're all staying safe. Title Update 10 has been live a couple of days, and I've managed to play enough now to give you my initial impressions of the loot generosity this update was meant to address. The devs even talked about this on State of the Game this week, explaining that TU10 was meant to make loot feel more rewarding for the time that you invest, meaning the harder the content, the better the rewards. Something pre-TU10 was absolutely lacking. Please leave your own feedback in the comments below and drop a like if you enjoy this one. You can support me on Patreon, link to that as well below. And with that said, let's begin. Title Update 10 brought a lot of changes to the game, but quite possibly the most important aspect of the game was to be addressed, and that was loot generosity. So what changed? Well, the patch notes relevant for this video for loot generosity is as follows. Updated item power distribution to have a better spread between minimum and maximum for all difficulties. Increased minimum rolled item power for field proficiency, DZ caches, clan caches and season caches. Regular loot from loot containers and missions now scale with mission difficulty. Targeted loot from loot containers and missions now scales with mission difficulty. Loot containers, part of the living world activities, now scale with global difficulty. Increased targeted loot drop chances for all mission and control point difficulties. Removed regular weapon, gear, loot containers not scaling with difficulty from control points, and increased the amount of scaling loot from the big control point reward container. Now, the first thing I did when I jumped into TU10 was roam the free world with a new build, actually, mainly just to see what the NPC drops were like, but also to test out kind of a new build, followed by doing some challenging and then heroic control points and activities, missions, that sort of thing. A few observations, both positive and negative, from about, I would say, about 10 hours of farming are negative-wise. Challenging content is really challenging when the attribute rolls can drop lower than 50%. Loot from heroic activities, whether that be control points or other world events or missions, are frequently dropping rolls that are about 80% plus, sometimes max, but at times the minimum attribute will be under 50%. Rainbow rolls, i.e. loot that drops with, say, weapon damage as the major attribute, but the other two attributes dropping as blue and then yellow, drop far too often for my liking, and a pass on this, I think, is required. Minor attributes on loot consistently contradict the brand set they actually roll on. Some positives are that whilst my RNG is pretty bad, I've seen plenty of reports from players speaking positively about the loot drop rolls being way better, and I've experienced this myself as well. Named items appear to be dropping more often from activities, and I've personally seen no purple drops from control point crates, missions or world activities, only from world containers that are not tied to an activity. So first off, check out this screenshot. Now, I took this right after completing a heroic world activity because I was frankly quite shocked at how low it rolled, to be honest. I cannot defend such a low minimum roll here on this Hana U piece for the crit damage value. If you look at the roll bar, you can see it's actually below 50% of the maximum it could roll. And this, again, is heroic content. This is the hardest content in the game outside of Legendary. Basically the hardest content that's doable solo, and yet the minimum roll bar is set below 50%. Imagine if you ran a heroic with the minimum rolls you can get from these drops. It would be pretty disgusting, to be honest. This minimum roll amount to me is just kind of unforgivable, to be honest. If you've got a good gear progression system in the game, then the loot you get from, say, heroic content should incrementally drop at a level that would allow you to exceed that challenge. If this system worked correctly, you would be able to take an impossible challenge, like Legendary, and make this a doable challenge when you farmed heroic, as the drops from that heroic level should give you the stats for it. The Division 2 kind of doesn't have that system. It kind of doesn't work that way because everything can drop to maximum, but also because the minimum rolls are so low. Instead, the devs actually give you the rewards that match the challenge, meaning the loot dropping is tuned to an amount that would allow you to beat the difficulty that you're playing rather than the difficulty above what you're playing. And this is a separate issue I may cover in a future video, but it goes back to those very low minimum rolls you can get on heroic difficulty. I can't imagine kind of like playing on hard right now, getting hard loot drops, and then trying to play challenging. This is why the transition from difficulty to difficulty is pretty brutal for the most part. It's very jarring. Even going from, say, challenging to heroic, for me personally, was quite hard. Not hard, but just in many ways, it was such a big leap, it didn't feel quite right. And because I've been getting kind of challenging loot from doing challenging, because it scales that way, it wasn't actually giving me the rolls for heroic, meaning that, yeah, the actual transition was crazy. I hope that kind of makes sense. And again, I'll probably cover that in a separate video, but I think it does go back to this thing about minimum rolls here. Here's another example, a low attribute roll on a weapon this time. The crit damage again below 50% from a heroic scale drop. And this is what I personally find annoying, because I think this minimum just needs to be increased quite a lot. I think heroic should be weighted towards a minimum of, say, 80% with the chance of a maximum roll. Legendary should at least be 90% for all attribute rolls, I think, because if you're playing on Legendary, for example, you're not doing that with builds that are at 60%. They're at least at about 85%, with most being nearer to the top end. They're for the people that have really min-maxed those builds. Now, aside from the low minimum rolls, though, and kind of on a positive note, I've seen an increase in higher attribute rolls dropping, which is great. And I've seen plenty of people report the same, so this is absolutely awesome and definitely is a huge change and speaks for the loot generosity changes that have been made here. It's worth noting here that if you are a player with builds that are already 95% min-maxed, then of course the chances of you getting something better than what you already have is going to be very, very low, and this update is unlikely to feel that much different for you. But I think that's to be expected with any looter shooter, I feel. Rainbow rolls. Now here's an example I pulled from Twitter, actually. So thanks to Cobra Cadet, who tagged me in this. As you can see, these are some Hana U gloves with crit hit chance and weapon handling attributes. Now, to be fair, I wish these back rolls would drop like this for me on something else, on maybe some Providence gloves. But this is not considered a rainbow roll, but speaks to an issue here because this is frequent. Hana U branded items, for the most part, are used in skill builds entirely. And of course, there's a possibility for this to be used as maybe some sort of skill DPS hybrid. But the frequency at which branded items drop with minor attribute rolls that completely contradict the brand set, I think is very frustrating. Do you know how many times I've had a Providence piece drop with both a yellow and blue attribute roll as well? Providence, like Walker Harrison Co., the new brand set, they're very much DPS branded sets because of their branded talents. Weapon damage, damage to armor, crit hit chance, crit hit damage, these are all red DPS attributes. So why then do I find it very difficult to actually find a Providence piece of gear with all red attributes? Why have I only ever come across a very few amount of Providence backpacks with all red attributes? It's rainbow rolls and rolls like this. Rainbow rolls are a big problem, especially because you can only recalibrate once. The frequency at which branded gear drops with attributes that contradict what the brand set is used for is too much as well. And I think this needs to be on the devs' radar for the next update on loot. I think the same needs to happen for weapon talents as well, quite possibly. Why does the ranger talent drop on shotguns? It's completely useless and it contradicts what the weapon is for. This is a weapon used up close, and yet the ranger talent is only used for marksman weapons that you're going to be quite a far away. So it really doesn't make that much sense to me. And these are just some of the frustrations that I think need to be addressed next. If I had a choice, the rainbow rolls for me would be the next thing that I look at when it comes to loot, because I think I can speak for everyone. I say it's frustrating when you get, say, Providence or Walker Harrison Co., and then you get a yellow and a blue attribute, and it happens so frequently. On a positive note, the frequency of named items appear to have increased quite a lot, actually, and there's nothing better than opening a control point chest and not seeing purples as well now. Some people have still been complaining about purple drops, but for me at least, I've not come across any purple drops unless I looted a world container, which of course is intended. People have reported running legendary missions and seen an increase in not only the amount of drops but also the quality of those drops as well, with god rolls becoming a lot more frequent. This is again very good news, but what I will say is, shouldn't this have always been the case? And I don't mean to put a negative twist on this, but Legendary is for the top kind of 5%, with most players going in with builds and groups that are almost min-max, so god rolls are almost always the only improvement they're going to get. Making sure they drop frequently is exactly how it should have always been. But not to take anything away from the devs, you know, this is good news. The changes appear to have made loot here way better than before, which should incentivize players to actually try and compete at some of the harder difficulties. If they were stuck in a rut, like for example me, I've been playing Challenging for a long time, but now that I know Heroic is going to give me better gear for the time that I invest into it, I've recently gone up to a Heroic and I've made that leap. So that's very, very good news, and I think that's what will happen for a lot of players, which is, you know, very, very good. In terms of targeted loot and caches, targeted loot appears to be way, way, way better than before. When TU10 went live, I immediately went and played some Wall Street because the targeted loot was gear sets, and I wanted to get my hands on the new, you know, Future Initiative, Foundry Bulwark, and System Protocol. To my relief, gear sets were dropping pretty much all over the place. It felt like every time there was an NPC drop, it would contain one targeted loot and then another high-end item. It was very infrequent that NPCs dropped high-end stuff that wasn't targeted loot. So from my experience, this is working way better than before, and as it should have been, you know, as it should have been all along. So that's good. Good stuff, developers. In respect of caches, I've only opened about 3 or 4 from PvP content, and the drops weren't great, really, you know, average attribute rolls across the board. So it's hard for me to say right now how these are, because I've only opened kind of like 3, and it could have just been bad RNG, and that makes sense with myself. But if you guys have got any more experience with caches specifically since TU10, then leave your feedback in the comments below. All in all, I do think that Title Update 10 has been a positive step forwards for loot generosity. Like anything, it's not perfect, but I really appreciate the effort made here by the devs to try and make loot feel more rewarding. I think minimum rolls really need to be increased to match the difficulty of the content loot is dropping at. I think as well, having an attribute roll at less than 50% of heroic difficulty is really out of touch with what minimum rolls are actually needed to compete at that difficulty, and what players feel is acceptable as a minimum roll. On paper, I think having a minimum roll of, say, something like 80% on heroic difficulty drops would better suit the difficulty and would be acceptable for players. It would for me, at least. Anything lower than that quickly becomes a very low roll and an unacceptable roll for heroic content. Rainbow rolls need to be addressed next, and attribute distribution. Having one yellow and one blue roll frequently on DPS brand sets like Provenance is very frustrating, and to me it really doesn't make much sense. The same can be applied to weapons and talents as well. Overall, the quality of loot is much better, and the quantity of that quality loot is more frequent, including named item drops, which is way better than before. Targeted loot is now completely viable and will be the best way to farm for specific items you may want. This is 3 steps forward when it comes to loot. I will be doing a more general feedback video on TU10 once I've played more, because TU10 wasn't just about loot, but I felt that this was something I had to address in a separate video, because not only did I have a lot to say about it, but I felt it was one of those major topics that needed its own video. Hope you enjoyed this one and managed to leave a comment with your own feedback down below. Thanks very much for all of your support, and I hope you all have a fantastic weekend. Until the next one, Epic out.